One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey guys, welcome back. We're talking about the cholesterol myth. And the last time we talked, I shared with you how the rates of deaths from heart disease were already on the decline well before the first statin drug hit the market. And I shared that the data suggests that this reduction in fatal heart attacks coincided with the trend for people to stop smoking. And this link between smoking and heart disease, it's very well known. And, of course, this chat we're having isn't about tobacco. It's still about cholesterol and how the push to get more people on statins at best has resulted in minimal reduction of deaths from heart disease. And if you remember that concept of the number needed to treat that we talked about, then you know that for a statin drug to save one life, there has to be anywhere from 83 to 212 people on statin drugs unnecessarily for that one person to benefit. And it's a range depending on if the people taking statins have a history of known heart disease, if they're just newly diagnosed, or they don't have a disease yet, but they have certain risk factors. And maybe what's worse, some of the people taking the statin drugs unnecessarily are going to experience side effects, some pretty nasty side effects, like the statin-induced myopathy, and even worse, some will develop or exacerbate type 2 diabetes. Not sure that that's a great trade-off. But I wanted to share one more point here on smoking and tobacco. Remember that I told you that deaths from heart disease increased from the early 1900s, and they peaked in the mid-1960s and then started to go down when the Surgeon General's report came out saying that smoking significantly increased heart disease and heart attacks and fatalities. Now, you can do this yourself. You can just go online, go to Google or something like that, and just search for tobacco use by decade, and then search heart attacks by decade or deaths from heart attacks by decade. And what you're going to find are two charts that look pretty much identical, meaning that the rise, the peak, and then the reduction of heart attacks almost exactly parallels the rise, peak, and reduction of tobacco use. And, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to put two and two together to conclude that as more people started smoking in the 1900s, more people started dying from heart attacks. And both charts show the same peak in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, whereafter both started to decline. Yet, despite there being half as many people smoking now than in the 1950s, the Surgeon General's report from 2014 concludes that changes in the tobacco industry have made modern cigarettes more deadly than ever before. And they cite the rise of lung cancer and COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. So fewer people smoke, but more people who smoke get diseases at higher rates than ever before, not just heart disease, but lung cancer and respiratory disease. All right, enough about that. Let's talk about good and bad cholesterol, HDL and LDL. So I'm going to share with you some of the early history of cholesterol research and how this whole cholesterol causes heart disease idea got started. It was back in the early 1900s, like 1904-ish, where Felix Marchand first introduced the term atherosclerosis. And he suggested that atherosclerosis, or plaquing of the arteries, was responsible for what we call clogged arteries. In 1908, about 4 years later, Ignatowski described a relationship between cholesterol-rich food and experimental atherosclerosis, meaning that we could create this in a lab. And so what he did was he fed rabbits a diet of meat, eggs, and milk, and he measured increases in cholesterol. And of course, meat, eggs, and milk are hardly the standard diet of rabbits. So we might logically expect some problems that has a research design like that anyways. Well, a few more years later, in 1910, Adolf Windaus showed that plaque deposits in animals, arteries of animals, contains 6 times as much cholesterol and 20 times as much esterified cholesterol as a normal arterial wall. And so it kind of seems like the evidence for cholesterol causing heart disease was beginning to mount. But it was a research study in 1913 by a Russian researcher named Nikolai Anichkov that really launched what we now know as the modern lipid hypothesis of heart disease. And in this study, what Anichkov did was he injected rabbits with different concentrations of cholesterol that was dissolved in sunflower oil. And he concluded that cholesterol was the causative agent in heart disease that they discovered in these rabbits. And for the next 35 years, little research was done in the field of lipidology because nobody else could reproduce Anichkov's results using animals other than rabbits. So it only happened in rabbits. It didn't happen in dogs. It didn't happen in rats. And as a result, Anichkov's lipid or cholesterol theory was abandoned. In 1929, researchers then discovered what we call lipoproteins, and this is where HDL and LDL come in. These are essentially little rafts or ferries that carry cholesterol, not ferry as in like a woodland ferry, but a ferry as in a boat, little ferries that carry cholesterol and triglycerides around in your blood. But the distinction between good and bad lipoproteins, or good and bad cholesterol, or HDL and LDL, didn't come until 1955 or so. And it seems that it was this discovery in the 1950s that renewed interest in the lipid hypothesis. Now, let me fast forward to the 1980s and another key player in the statin story. His name is Akira Endo. He's a Japanese researcher. And so in the 1970s, Endo had already discovered a metabolite of a fungus that inhibited cholesterol synthesis, and this led to the entire statin class of drugs. And this is the initiation of statin therapy. And this is where the story starts to get interesting, because Endo's drug company eventually shut down their research because the dogs that they were experimenting on with this early form of a statin drug developed what looked like stomach cancer. Some of them developed cataracts, and other animals, dogs particularly, they went completely blind. And somewhere around the same time, there was another drug company named Merrill, who was one of several companies that were racing to be the first to develop a workable statin drug. They were sued for civil damages and had to pay $50 million to people who had taken their drugs and experienced major side effects. And that was a massive sum. $50 million back in the 1980s was an awful lot of money. And during the court case, it was discovered that the executives of this company called Merrill knew of the potential toxicities, and they lied to the FDA about it. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that modern statins do this, but this is the history of statin drug development. And it's a little dark and murky and sometimes riddled with controversy, because even back in the 1970s, there was fervent criticism by many physician groups about the idea that cholesterol causes heart disease. Most of them thought it was absolutely ridiculous. Now, I've heard stories that I haven't been able to confirm myself, that in the 1980s, Endo went back to Anichkov's original research from 1913, and he tried to duplicate his experiment. And apparently what Endo discovered was that Anichkov didn't inject those rabbits with pure cholesterol, which we know at the very least it included sunflower oil, right? So it was cholesterol dissolved in sunflower. But according to the stories that I've heard, the solution also contained a synthetic preservative that later turned out to be pro-inflammatory. And so some people speculate that the reason why Anichkov showed that cholesterol injected into rabbits led to heart disease wasn't because it was the cholesterol that damaged their blood vessels, but actually it was the synthetic preservative, which, being pro-inflammatory, that was the causative agent. And again, the story goes that Akira Endo redesigned Anichkov's experiment, and he did separate out pure cholesterol by itself with nothing else, and that injecting pure cholesterol into the rabbits didn't cause any heart disease. Now, so take that for what it is, but it's an interesting point in the story of how all this came about. So I think if you sit back and you look at the history of how this developed, we really start to see the true story emerges, because we went from this very simplistic thought that cholesterol causes heart disease to the understanding of different types of cholesterol, which then divided total cholesterol into good and bad, right? HDL cholesterol is the good guy and LDL cholesterol is the bad guy. And so the efforts then to lower the rates of heart attack and stroke started to focus not necessarily on just your total cholesterol, but specifically the LDL cholesterol, which worked in some cases and didn't in others. And I mentioned recently that, a more recent study showed that 75 to 85% of people hospitalized for heart attacks on statin drugs have normal cholesterol, yet they still had heart attacks. So clearly there's more to the story. Now, just over a year ago, in April of 2020, the journal called Biomedicines published a review paper. Now, I want to read, it's just like 3 sentences long, but let me read to you the paper's opening statement. It reads, quote, "Despite significant medication-induced reduction in LDL cholesterol, a large pool of cardiovascular disease risk remains. The often quoted 25% relative risk reduction attributed to LDL cholesterol reduction is actually only a 3.5% absolute risk reduction." End quote. So let me translate this to you, because what we've all been fed about the success of statin drugs is what you could call statistical jibber jabber. It's not an official term. I just made that up. There's a large body of work. It's called the Scandinavian simvastatin or statin survival study. That's quite often quoted, and this is where this 25% reduction in risk for heart attack and death comes from. So in this Scandinavian statin survival study, they took 4,400 people who had known heart disease. So everybody had heart disease. They put half of the group on statin drugs, a statin drug, and the other half went on a placebo, and they followed them for 5.5 years. And at the end of the study, they tallied up how many people died and whether they died from heart-related events or something else. And then they compared the heart-related death rates between the two groups. And the conclusion was that taking statin drugs reduced death from heart attacks by 25%. And you'll hear this number over and over and over again in the medical community. And in this study, both groups had almost exactly the same number of people, right? There was 4,400 people total. There were 2,223 people who didn't get a statin, and there were 2,221 people who did. So it was a difference of only 2 people in each group. So the groups were essentially identical, at least in the number of the people in each group. And if you speak only of heart-related deaths, 189 of the people who didn't get a statin drug died from heart, while only 111 of people using statin drugs died of heart disease. That is a 25% reduction. From 189 down to 111 is a 25% reduction, and it sure makes it sound like taking a statin drug is a good idea. And mathematically, we can truthfully state that there was a 25% difference between the two groups. But this is called a relative risk analysis, which compares the total number of deaths in one group to the total number of deaths in another. So, relatively speaking, going from 189 down to 111 is a difference of 25%, which, as the authors state, is mathematically or statistically significant. But here's the thing, and I want you to listen to this. We hear about statistical significance all the time, and it is important. But sometimes mathematical significance does not equate to clinical significance. Sometimes you have both, sometimes you only have one. What we're looking for is clinical significance. So what may be more clinically significant is to not look at relative risk reduction, but looking at the absolute risk reduction within each group by itself, not the relative risk reduction between the two, which means that instead of comparing the number of deaths in one group to the other, you look at how many deaths there were in each group to the total number of people in each group. That's the absolute risk reduction. And for this study, it shows something completely different. It doesn't show a 25% risk reduction. Now, I'm going to throw some numbers. I know I just did. I'm going to throw some more numbers at you. So just hang with me for a second. So in this placebo group that did not get a statin drug, there were 189 deaths out of 2,223 people. That means that 8.5% of the people not taking statin drugs died of heart-related issues. In the statin group, which had only 2 fewer people, so essentially the same number of people, 111 people died. And 111 people out of 2,221 is a 5% death rate in the statin group. And so looking at things this way shows us that the death rate within the non-statin group, again, was 8.5%. But for the statin use group, the death rate was 5%. So while the relative risk reduction is a whopping 25%, the absolute risk reduction is only 3.5%. That is clinically irrelevant. Both statements of risk reduction are true. The numbers are not lying to you. But when someone says that statin drugs result in a 25% risk reduction in deaths without clarifying that this is a relative measure, they can use numbers like this to make the benefits of statin drugs seem much larger than they really are. In other words, researchers and drug companies can quote relative numbers to exaggerate benefit and oftentimes will quote absolute numbers to minimize the risk of side effects. And I'm going to whisper this so the watchdogs don't hear. This is exactly what they did with all the COVID research. This is mathematical sleight of hand that borders on lying, but it uses the truth to do it. There's an old saying, how does it go? Figures don't lie, but liars can figure. So let me restate this for you. If you have heart disease and decide to go on a statin drug, it only reduces your risk of dying from a heart attack by 3.5%, not 25%. Which brings me back to the idea that an awful lot of people have to take statin drugs without benefit, plus run the risk of some potentially serious side effects so that just one person doesn't have a heart attack. And what this really means is, to be honest, we're not very good at predicting who is going to have a heart attack or stroke or who won't. And if we were, nobody would be taking statin drugs unnecessarily. And that assumes that statins are at least modestly effective at preventing death, and it doesn't appear that they are. Which brings me back to the idea of good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. I've already said it, and I'm sure you've heard, HDL is the good cholesterol, LDL is the bad. But did you know that if your HDL is too high, then it might mean that you're inflamed, and that there are 2 different types of LDL? Right? So the story keeps getting more and more interesting. And despite the fact that right now we know more about cholesterol than ever before, deaths from heart disease are still the #1 killer worldwide. So just based on the numbers, most of us probably are going to die from a heart attack or stroke or cancer. That's just the numbers. And I recently heard somebody say that, the goal is to die with heart disease and not to die from heart disease. Right? It's that inevitable, but in most cases, it's manageable. So let's talk about this HDL and LDL, this good and the bad cholesterol. First of all, HDL and LDL themselves are not cholesterol. They contain cholesterol. Right? When we talk about HDL cholesterol, we're actually referring to these transport molecules, these ferries or rafts called lipoproteins that contain some amount of cholesterol and triglyceride. And that allows us to move cholesterol and triglycerides either into the body and into the tissues or out of the body to get rid of it. So think of HDL and LDL, these lipoproteins, as buses or ferries that carry people or cholesterol and triglycerides from one location to another. And HDL is typically called the good cholesterol because it picks up cholesterol and triglycerides from the body, from the tissues, and brings them to the liver to be processed and eliminated. And so it's called good because of the idea that too much cholesterol in the body is bad, which may not be true, so that anything that gets rid of cholesterol must therefore be good. That's the logic. I'm not saying it's good logic, but that's the logic. Now, it is good not just because it helps us meaning HDL cholesterol or HDL lipoproteins, that is good. Not just because it helps us to control cholesterol balance, which we do need to do, but because HDL does other things as well. And there are, maybe two main underappreciated roles of HDL. First is its anti-inflammatory capacity. HDL has both anti-inflammatory and antioxidant functions, and it can inhibit how inflammation damages the bad LDL cholesterol, which is kind of what turns it toxic. HDL can also inhibit certain types of immune cells from sticking to the inside of your blood vessels, which is part of how inflammation eventually causes damage and leads to heart disease. So we want HDL to be higher up to a certain point because we know that inflammation can increase the amount of HDL that you're making, such that when HDL levels reach about 85 on your labs, and I'm using standard American units now, so when your HDL reaches about 85, we start thinking, hey, there might be some inflammation going on. The higher that HDL number goes, the more likely it is that there is an inflammatory process that's not being identified and controlled. But let me clarify something here. Let's say that you're inflamed, and let's say your HDL is 95 or 100 or 110. I might start looking for where and why you're inflamed, but I'm not going to try to reduce your HDL. Because high HDL is a potential red flag for inflammation, but it's not a problem in and of itself. So if I mistake high HDL for inflammation itself and not just a sign of inflammation, and if I don't understand that HDL actually has anti-inflammatory capacity to it, I might conclude that I need to reduce HDL, which means you're going to lose some cardioprotection. But there's one more underappreciated function of HDL, and that is its ability to bind to toxins. Yes, just remember that toxins, both biological and environmental, are what we call lipophilic. That means that they bind easily to fats. And we have research that shows HDL capable of binding to and helping to detoxify your body from things like BPA or certain types of pesticides and persistent organic pollutants. Plus, HDL has shown not only to bind some biological toxins like lipopolysaccharides, but actually to have antibacterial properties. So while HDL is usually appreciated as the good cholesterol, it's vastly underappreciated for its many other roles. Now, if you have low HDL, you can surmise that you lose some quantum of what HDL does for you. So it leaves you at risk for less heart protection, let's say it that way, lower your control of inflammation and oxidative stress, as well as a decreased ability to bind to and clear out toxins of various kinds. So practically speaking, how do you increase your HDL if it's low? Well, priority number one, if you're smoking, stop. That's a big deal. But very simply, exercise, having good body composition, like losing body fat if you're overweight, and either eating healthy fatty fish or using fish oil every day to the tune of maybe 2 to 3 grams of EPA and DHA every day. So that's kind of a quick summary of HDL, what we call the good cholesterol. When it's high, we see it as a potential sign of inflammation. When it's low, we know that we're losing some of the benefits that HDL does for us. Let's move on to LDL, what we call the bad cholesterol. So it's considered the bad guy again because it moves cholesterol into the body, not out of it. So LDL picks up cholesterol and triglycerides and ferries it into your tissues where it drops cholesterol off for your cells to use. And the distinction between good and bad is as simple as that. Which direction does it flow in? If it flows into your body, we call it bad because we think cholesterol is bad in your body. And if it brings it out of your body, like with HDL, then we consider that good. But, that obviously is very, very simplistic. Remember in 1955, I said that we started to understand that cholesterol was again transported in the body in these lipoprotein ferries, LDL and HDL. But it wasn't until sometime later than that we understood that there were subtypes of both HDL and LDL. And this might be why some people have high LDL, but they don't have heart attacks. And it might also be why people have normal LDL total and they still have heart attacks, right? It turns out that LDL as a parent category is made up of two different subtypes, one of which carries more risk than the other. And that subtype of LDL that carries more risk is called small, dense LDL. The subtype of LDL that carries much less risk is called large, buoyant LDL. So we have small, dense, which is risky, and we have large and buoyant, which is less risky. So when your doctor runs your labs and says, hey, your cholesterol is high, that usually means that your LDL is high because it makes up about 70% of your total cholesterol. So high cholesterol usually means high LDL, but that doesn't tell you if your LDL is the risky small dense variety or the less risky buoyant large variety. So to understand if high LDL is even really a problem for you, you have to test one layer deeper to see if your LDL is mostly small and dense or mostly large and buoyant. And that testing is now readily available with tests, kind of like they call it the NMR test or the LDL subfraction test. So the next time your MD says that he or she wants you to go on a statin drug to lower your LDL cholesterol and reduce the risk of having a heart attack, you should ask them if your LDL is the risky small dense type, usually shortened to small dense LDL, or is it the less risky large buoyant? And so the evidence right now is quite clear that having a higher small dense LDL is far more predictive of heart disease than your total LDL and way outperforms your total cholesterol in terms of predicting risk. And what this means now is that you should never be satisfied with a simple lipid panel, your cholesterol panel, to gauge your risk of heart disease. You simply can't extrapolate with any degree of certainty who will or will not get heart disease, let alone die of heart disease, by looking at your total cholesterol and your total LDL because you can't see the subtypes. So if that's what your doctor or doctors are basing their decisions and recommendations on, then you can assume that they're either not up to date or, maybe simply being lazy and not doing their job, because it's a lot easier just to write a statin drug prescription. It's much easier to do that than it is to see high cholesterol, order more tests, more detailed testing, or heaven forbid, actually tell you, stop smoking and get your act together by improving your diet and your lifestyle. It's much easier to pull out a prescription pad. Now, don't get me wrong. I've said this so many times on the podcast. I, for one, am very grateful for conventional medicine. It serves a crucial role in emergencies and established diseases. I myself have been on the receiving end of very good conventional medicine with orthopedic injuries and surgeries by great medical doctors and nurses. But when it comes to cardiovascular disease, thinking that we're going to save the world one statin drug at a time is folly. It's foolishness. And thinking that all you have to do is take your statin and you're going to be healthy is, again, folly and foolishness. Even if we accept that at least some of the risk in heart disease does come from alterations in your lipid balance, and it does, we still haven't asked why that happens. We haven't asked about the root cause of changes in HDL and LDL and triglycerides that lead to the risk of heart attacks and stroke. So what is the root cause? Well, for some, there's genetic predisposition. If you have a family history of early death from heart disease, this could be significant for you. But, for most of us, we don't have that family history. But regardless, even if you have a genetic profile that's working against you, the answers to reducing your risk for heart attack and stroke lie in the same place. You have to work on shoring up the foundations of your metabolic health. So when I teach this to doctors in weekend seminars, and I'm getting ready to fly to Boise to do that just in a week or so, we don't talk about cholesterol and heart disease until we cover the functional foundations of health first, because that's where the greatest opportunity for improvement and protection for your heart comes from. So quit thinking about HDL as, purely the good cholesterol, the higher the better, could be a sign of inflammation. Quit thinking of LDL as the bad, because what type of LDL do you actually have? Understand that higher HDL may mean you're inflamed and toxic. And it's good that your HDL is high, but it shows you that there's something else going on. And a high LDL isn't that bad when most of your LDL is this large buoyant type that carries much less risk than the small dense type. So as I close for today, let me go back to the book, The Cholesterol Myth, that I mentioned before. In that book, the author, Dr. Steven Sinatra, who's, I'm sure he's retired at this point, retired cardiologist, he describes small, dense LDL as a bullet and large, buoyant LDL as a beach ball. Right? If your blood vessels get hit by a large, buoyant, soft, squishy beach ball, it's not going to hurt the blood vessel. But if your blood vessels get hit by a high-velocity, small, dense bullet, the potential for damage is significantly more, and the risk for heart disease increases dramatically. So as it relates to high cholesterol and your LDL levels, the question becomes, do you have more bullets or do you have more beach balls? That's a critical question. All right, guys, that's it for today. Thanks for listening.